أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، الحضور الكرام، نتشرف في قمة المعرفة 2016 بحضور إحدى الشخصيات المؤثرة عالمياً التي لمع صاحبها كسياسي بارز وأدى دوراً مهماً على مستوى بلاده والعالم، واليوم يتكرم بمشاركتنا آرائه، تجاربه القيمة في جلسة حوارية مع أحد نجوم الإعلام الإعلامي في حوار خاص مع مذيعة العالمية لقناة CNN السيدة بيكي أندرسون، فليتفضلوا مشكورين.
Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back. We at the Knowledge Summit are honored to have amongst us a world figure that has played an important role not only in shaping his country, but shaping in the world that we live in today. Here to moderate this session, please join me in welcoming CNN's Becky Anderson.
Right, a very good afternoon to you all. This session is not about me. It is about an incredibly important and interesting mind who will be joining us here on the stage for what is the third session here of the Knowledge Summit 2016. I am Becky Anderson. I'm anchor of Connect the World on CNN International and managing editor of CNN here in the Middle East. The UAE is my home, and reading is a very deep passion of mine, not least because my mum, who is 85 this year and has just retired, spent 60 years in teaching, involved in teaching the disadvantaged to read. So we're here today to talk, amongst other things, about a topic that's a real honour for me. My guest today has also demonstrated a great interest in promoting literacy and cultivating a passion for reading. Mr. Tony Abbott is the 28th Prime Minister of Australia, has been an MP since 1994 and served as the leader of the Liberal Party of Australia from 2009 to 2015. This is a man who really knows his stuff. In 2012, Australia had its own National Year of Reading. Its target was to show that Australia was a nation of readers. So today I'm going to be asking him about that initiative and finding out not only what it achieved, but also discovering what broader lessons were learnt in Australia that might be instructive to hear in the UAE and around the Arab world. So without further ado, please welcome onto the stage today Mr. Tony Abbott.
Well, thank you so much, Becky, and thanks everyone for being here for this session. It's an honour again to speak with you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion after this formal presentation. I should let you know that even as Australia's Prime Minister, I spent many hours in schools and classrooms because education is the key to our future. While a front bencher in the Australian Parliament, I actually spent 3 weeks as a teacher's aide in a small school in a remote settlement in Northern Australia. And this is how it came about. Late in 2007, I'd become Shadow Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, responsible for those people who were there before the European settlement of Australia. And while I'd been to dozens of Aboriginal communities in my years as a Member of Parliament, I'd never stayed in any of them longer than overnight. So I called a friend of mine, perhaps our most significant Aboriginal leader, a man called Noel Pearson, seeking his help to spend some settled time amongst the original Australians. He arranged for me to go to Cowan, a village of 300 people, an 8-hour drive over mostly dirt roads north of Cairns in Queensland, where I was going to help in the local school. I'd then been a Member of Parliament for 14 years, a Cabinet Minister for 6 years, and the Leader of the House of Representatives for 5 years, and now I was helping to teach 7-year-olds how to read. It was, in every sense, one of the most instructive times of my life. These days, as I'm sure you'd understand, Australians honour our Aboriginal people. But despite spending quite literally billions of dollars every year to help, They still have much lower levels of education, much higher levels of unemployment, domestic violence and imprisonment, much lower incomes and much earlier deaths. Much of this is due to the welfare system that pays people to do nothing, that Pearson calls the poison that's killing our people. Much of it is due to different and lower expectations of Aboriginal people due to culture. This is our tragedy. Even in one of the most free, fair and prosperous countries on earth, a very large percentage of our first people are still living a third world existence. In remote areas, many Aboriginal people are effectively illiterate. So by teaching in that 50-pupil primary school, I was in the midst of the struggle for Australia's future. I wasn't so much talking it as living it. And I have to tell you that back then the struggle wasn't going well, because even though Cowan School had one of the highest attendance rates of any remote school, its academic results, judged by standardised tests, were about 50% below the national average. There were 2 good teachers there, but the teacher with whom I spent most of my time was just out of training, and her class was anarchy. Almost every day, this 20-something young woman was reduced to tears by her 6, 7 and 8-year-old tormentors. The problem was that there was no structure to her lessons. Each child was supposed to learn more or less independently, inspired rather than directed by the teacher. This might have worked if these youngsters were from stable homes where learning was valued and where books were treated with respect. But most of Cowan's kids came from homes where no one read books, few parents had jobs, and many adults slept during the day and partied during the night. So it was often a struggle just to keep children awake, let alone to have them learn. And while awake, they were often climbing over each other rather than sitting still. That was in 2008. The following year, I spent 10 days in the school at Arakoon, a somewhat larger village further up Cape York, and the classes there were, if anything, even more chaotic. But even then, I'm pleased to say, things were starting to change. Thanks to Pearson and his colleagues at the Cape York Institute, something known as direct instruction was starting to come into remote schools. I was there in the classroom at Cowan. As a part of the day, was given over to a program called Multilit, making up lost time in literacy for kids with retarded schooling and very poor reading skills. These youngsters were taught to focus on letters, not whole words, and to sound out those letters so that what they saw on the page resembled what they heard and could usually understand. It was very similar to the way I had myself been taught half a century earlier, but it was, I have to say, very different from the educational methodologies that had in the meantime become fashionable while Western countries were questioning their traditional values and standards. Essentially, direct instruction involves very structured, very disciplined lessons where the teacher knows in advance exactly what's to be learned in that class and is constantly going back to the students, revising to make sure they've grasped it. It works because the students soon recognise that they are making progress. In every class, they are conscious that they know more at the end than they did at the beginning. I have seen for myself, quite literally, the thrill of achievement on the faces of children who would previously have been bored and looking for distraction. I know that direct instruction was holding these youngsters' attention in a way that nothing else could, because they were not distracted from their lessons, even by the presence of a Prime Minister in their classroom. In 2012, as opposition leader, I returned to Arakoon, and progress at that school was palpable, largely because the former child-centred classes had mostly reverted to direct instruction. And last year, as Prime Minister, I returned to Cape York to see schools where forms of direct instruction had been operating for several years. And the difference that just a decade had made was remarkable. Cowan School, for instance, is now close to matching the national average for literacy and numeracy. The difference between these schools and most other schools in remote Australia, indeed most schools, wherever communities are disengaged from education, is absolutely extraordinary. Now, in my country, failing schools are not a racial or a cultural phenomenon. They're common wherever unemployment is high and parents and children see little point in learning. What these schools need is teaching methods that program children to succeed, not fail, and that give teachers the skills and techniques that can work with all children and not just the naturally interested ones. My government, back in 2014, invested $22 million towards what we called a Good to Great Schools program to give dozens of remote schools the kind of structured classroom teaching that disadvantaged children need if they are to master the basics of reading, writing, counting and thinking. Now, I don't say that direct instruction is right for all classes in all subjects in all schools, but it does provide nearly all pupils with the foundation on which higher learning can be based. I don't say that programs delivering direct instruction are free from criticism, but there's little service delivery by government in remote areas that's always as cost effective as we'd like. I don't say that direct instruction can provide the cultural understandings that young Aboriginal people often crave. But in Cape York schools, this was being provided by local elders after school hours. But I do say that direct instruction is the best way for struggling students and struggling schools to improve, as the experts now concede. In fact, the 2010 McKinsey International School Study showed that transforming poor schools invariably had these 4 elements: introduce scripted instruction, get students to attend, ensure that children are fed, and train teachers in effective classroom delivery. And this must be our mission, because a school that doesn't teach effectively is worse than a mere childminding centre. It betrays our children. Indeed, it brings to mind the words of Jesus of Nazareth, who said it would be better to have a millstone hung around his neck and to be thrown into the sea than to cause any of these little ones to stumble. And sadly, too many of our schools are causing these little ones to stumble. I make 2 final points. First, there are too many people, even in positions of authority, who are threatened by success. Unfortunately, there is a large academic establishment with a vested interest in discrediting teaching that works. Hence, progress in this area is often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Second, educational success depends as much on values and on standards as on funding. Over the past 15 years, Australian school funding has close to doubled, but our academic performance compared to other countries has fallen, and on some measures we're now surpassed by a country such as Kazakhstan. Our education system is suffused with the soft bigotry of low expectations. Less than 10% of Australian students do top-level maths, for instance, compared to more than 50% in Singapore. So we must learn. We must learn even from our failures. Under the current Prime Minister, no less than in my time, we are determined to get the educational fundamentals right. And this means a demanding curriculum, involved parents, empowered school principals, and excellent teachers, as well as adequate funding. Now, it's said that the definition of madness is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. To improve, we have to change. And the smartest change is to stop doing what's been proven to fail. Now, you might think that's a penetrating statement of the obvious, but Australia is not the only country, and education is not the only field where we might usefully rethink what manifestly doesn't work. I'm tremendously encouraged to see so many people here in Dubai and from around the world and from around this region who are burning with a mission to get more people reading, to get more people educated, because this is by far the best way to build the better world that all of us crave.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, sir. That was fantastic to hear. We heard earlier on today, and for those in the audience who've been here listening to these fascinating sessions, you'll have heard too what I would describe as fairly shocking statistics on literacy across the Arab world, which I guess bear out the importance of this being the year of reading in the UAE, and the importance of the launch of the Arab Reading Index, which we heard about earlier on. But in your experience, are those two initiatives enough for change?
Well, what you don't want is gimmicks. And things like years of reading can easily be a PR gimmick. The important thing is that at every level we are actually making the kinds of changes necessary to try to give our youngsters the best possible start in life. And a youngster who doesn't learn how to read, write, count and think is a youngster who has been dreadfully let down by his betters, his elders.
You talked about a period when you suggested that in Australia you were in the midst of a struggle for the very identity and future of the country. You could argue that we are in the midst of a struggle for the very future of the Arab region at present. The Mohammed bin Rashid initiatives work hard to encourage and foster education in crisis situations. And let's face it, across the Arab world, we have a number of crisis situations. You talked earlier about the work that you did with disenfranchised communities in Australia. Can you just give us a little bit more about your experience, what you learned that we might be able to use when thinking about the hundreds of thousands of kids, for example, living in refugee camps around this region?
Well, don't fall for educational fads, don't fall for gimmicks, do what works. And what the educational establishment in Australia is belatedly rediscovering is that some of those old traditional methods, rote learning, very disciplined classrooms, are essential if we are to succeed. Now, obviously, once you've got the basics, then we can have free-ranging discussions and we can wander off into self-directed learning and all the rest of it. But if you don't have the basics, reading, writing and counting, nothing else really works. So get the foundations right, and then other things will flow from that.
I talked about this being a roiling region. While I've got you here, it was fascinating to hear your discussion on education and on reading and literacy initiatives, and we'll have a lot more, I know, at this conference on what's going on here. I do think I should take the opportunity to cross-examine you just a little bit on what is going on at present. We have the slippage from this region of migrants moving across Europe, which may or may not be, I would argue it is, one of the reasons that we are seeing what we are across Europe at the moment and beyond, this rising wave of populism. When you sit back and reflect what you are seeing, the Brexit vote, the Trump phenomenon, we are seeing populism from effectively the Philippines to Philadelphia. How do you perceive what's going on and what happens next?
Well, the first point to make is that despite all the difficulties of the present time, the ongoing problems here in the Middle East, this caliphate of evil, which has caused, or at least is one of the factors in what's happening in Syria and the toxicity which is spreading. Despite that, despite difficulties in Eastern Europe, despite difficulties in East Asia, we've got to remember, Becky, that this is still a wonderful world, which is probably getting better on balance, not worse. Someone showed me some statistics the other day. In 1980, less than half the world's population had access to clean drinking water. Today, more than 90% do. In 1990, 37% of the world's population lived in absolute poverty. Today, it's just 9%. In the last quarter century, global gross domestic product has increased by more than in the previous 25,000 years. So together, despite everything, remarkable things are being achieved. And yet, what's happening in Syria and northern Iraq is barbarity on a scale not seen since the Middle Ages. And the evil that's being done there, the people doing it aren't seeking to hide it. They're whacking it up on YouTube for the world to see. They're boasting about it. So this is a dreadful problem, and the ramifications are spreading far and wide. As Prime Minister, I used to say that Australia did not willingly reach out to other conflicts, but sometimes those conflicts reach out to us, and that's why it's important to be intelligently and sensibly involved. Now, plainly, the floods of people, not just from Syria, but from many other parts of the world, into what has effectively become a borderless Europe, that is causing enormous shockwaves right around the continent.
An enormous consternation by many in leadership around this region and beyond about what they do next when they call Washington going forward.
And people have a right, countries have a right to keep their character. And this is why uncontrolled movement of people into countries is something that simply cannot be tolerated.
If you were still Prime Minister and you knew that it was effectively a President Trump that you were calling going forward, how would you feel about that? I mean, reflect, if you will, on what you've heard to date and what happens next.
Well, President-elect Trump is the legitimately elected leader of the United States. And as such, I would regard him as the leader of the free world, and as such, I think he should be respected. That doesn't mean that everything he says or does will be necessarily supported or agreed with, even by a close ally of the United States, such as Australia. But the Trump election, like the Brexit vote some months ago, like the Italian vote in the last little while, is a sign that throughout much of the world there is a discontent with the political establishment. I think this outsiders versus insiders phenomenon is very strong. Now, it's interesting, here in Dubai, and in the Emirates more generally, you have islands of stability and prosperity compared to so much that's happening in the Middle East, and even compared to what's happening in other parts of the world. So something is going right here, and it's important to appreciate it, and where possible celebrate it and emulate it. But we must always remember that prosperity and stability are fragile, and you must be constantly working to maintain them.
I have to ask you why I've got you here. When are you going to get back into headline politics?
Well,
Going to stand for Prime Minister again? Go on, tell us.
well, Becky,
You're among friends.
I'm not out of headline politics. I'm still a member of Parliament in Australia. Obviously, I'm not a Prime Minister or even a front bencher, but nevertheless, I'm doing my best to ensure that I remain a strong voice for what we might describe as liberal conservative values and policies.
This is a Knowledge Summit 2016. This is the third edition, as it were, iteration of this. When you consider the word knowledge and you consider what the UAE is doing with a summit like this and how it's developing its human capital as it moves towards its future, and we talk about future foresight here, what would your takeaways be?
I always try to be as practical as possible, and you can see with your own eyes, every sense tells you that this place is successful in a way that so many other places are not. And I guess when a successful country says, let's talk about something which we think is important, others want to listen. And I suppose the features of the UAE which distinguish it from many of its comparable countries are respect for tradition, but openness to change, a system and prominent individuals in the system that know that government is a business of give and take, that there has got to be something in it for most people if a society is to succeed. There can be no permanently disenfranchised, no permanently embittered minorities. That, if you like, is the fundamental knowledge which is apprehended by the people who make things happen here, that you've got to move with the times while at the same time building on your traditional strengths.
And that, of course, speaks to the idea of literacy and reading and affording everybody.
Because if you can't read, if you don't learn, you're effectively a prisoner of the present. How do we unlock the secrets of the past? We unlock the secrets of the past through reading. How do we know what it was like 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? Well, we can talk to our grandparents perhaps about 50 years ago, but we have to read to find out about 100 years ago. And yet the events of 100 years ago, even in this part of the world, perhaps 1,000 years ago, they have echoes today. So we need to understand them, we need to make sense of them, we need to some extent to assimilate them if we are to make the most of the future.
Speaking of reading, Omar Gabash, the UAE ambassador to Russia, recently published an article in Foreign Policy. If you haven't read it, those of you in the audience, I suggest you do. I mean, it's a fantastic piece. It's effectively, Tony, it's a letter to his young son, and it's advice as a whole for young Muslims, and it's entitled How to Survive in an Age of Extremism and Islamophobia. And like I say, it was a letter to his young son, but about an issue which sort of dominates the thinking of any parent in this region at this time. Important stuff. Absolutely.
And you look at, a place like Dubai. Obviously, the animating spirit here is conducive to so much that we value. People don't flee Dubai, they flock to Dubai. What's happening here is just about all good. So there is nothing in Islam which precludes the kind of things that we all want and value, and yet there are some people who, in the name of Islam, are acting in ways which are simply barbaric. Now, this is a matter which only Muslims can really resolve, but it must be resolved, and it must be resolved as quickly as possible for the safety of the whole world. This is why what President El-Sisi said a couple of years back at Al-Azhar had such extraordinary resonance, because he was asking people to confront a whole lot of things which had been taken for granted for a long, long time, and it sounds like the ambassador has been doing much the same.
Give it a read. It's well worth a read. Certainly for those of you in the audience, like I say, I suggest you will have a read of it too. You've been an absolute pleasure and delight. I'm going to allow you to get up and have some lunch and let our audience also go. But thank you for being with us, and thank you for your keynote. And let's applaud, if we will, the UAE's Year of Reading in 2016. Thank you very much indeed.